Imagine walking into a room and instantly, without even thinking, you've scanned every face, measured the tension in the air, and adjusted your entire personality to make sure no one is upset. You call it being considerate. But what if this hyper-awareness isn't a social gift, but a survival reflex? Think about that one person who refuses to ask for help, even when they're drowning in work, or the friend who feels a wave of guilt the moment they sit down to rest. We often praise these traits as strength or work ethic, yet they frequently mask a silent, invisible ache from the past. Why do you feel like a burden just for existing? And how did these normal habits become your silent language of distress? But here is the part that most people miss. These behaviors aren't just quirks. They are the sophisticated echoes of a childhood, where your needs were simply quiet. Let's peel back the layers of what you've always called just the way I am. But here is the part that most people miss. For years, we've been told that childhood trauma is defined by what did happen, the loud arguments, the visible scars, or the presence of chaos. We categorize neglect as a failure to provide food or shelter. But the silent reality is often much more subtle. Emotional neglect is not the presence of something bad, it is the absence of something vital. Emotional responsiveness. It is the nothing that happened when you needed something. Dr. Janice Webb, in her foundational 2012 study, identified this as childhood emotional neglect, CEN. Unlike physical trauma, CEN is invisible, leaving no bruises, only a hollow space where a child's emotional validity should have been. Research in developmental psychology suggests that when a caregiver consistently fails to mirror a child's emotions, the child's brain undergoes a strategic shutdown to survive the rejection. You didn't become low maintenance by choice. You were conditioned to believe that your needs were a secondary priority. But how does this invisible void manifest in your adult life today? Let's look at the first sign that you might have mistaken for a personality trait. But here is the unsettling truth. The very strengths you are proud of today might actually be the scars of a past you don't even remember as traumatic. Have you ever found yourself struggling with a heavy suitcase or a complex project, yet the words, "Can you help me?" feel physically impossible to utter? To the outside world, you are the reliable one, the pillar of strength who never asks for anything. But beneath this "I'm fine" armor lies a haunting paradox. You don't refuse help because you are strong. You refuse it because, as a child, asking for support was met with silence or annoyance. In a landmark study on attachment theory, researcher Mary Ainsworth, 1970, identified the avoidant attachment style, where children learn to suppress their distress because their caregivers are emotionally unavailable. You've conditioned yourself to believe that needing others is a weakness, a burden that might lead to rejection. But here is the part that stings. By never letting anyone in, you are inadvertently recreating the very loneliness you tried to escape. You think you are protecting your independence, but are you actually just guarding an old wound that never had the chance to heal? This relentless self-reliance is just the surface. The way you perceive others' emotions is where the survival reflex truly becomes visible. Do you often find yourself reading the room with a precision that feels almost like a superpower? You can detect a slight shift in someone's breathing, a subtle tightening of a jawline, or the heavy rhythm of a footstep in the hallway. While others see this as being highly intuitive or empathetic, in the world of psychology, this is often hyper-vigilance. When it is the survival mechanism of a child who had to become an emotional detective to stay safe. When a caregiver is emotionally unpredictable or neglected, the child must learn to anticipate moods to avoid conflict or seek a rare moment of connection. You've learned to blend in, to change your colors to match the emotional temperature of others, often at the cost of your own identity. But here is the silent tragedy. When you spend all your energy monitoring everyone else's internal weather, who is looking after yours? You aren't just good with people. You are an expert at disappearing so others can feel comfortable. This constant scanning doesn't just exhaust your mind. It bleeds into your productivity, turning your moments of rest into a source of deep, unexplained anxiety. Do you feel a sudden wave of anxiety the moment you sit down on the couch without a productive task in hand? For many, relaxation isn't a reward. It feels like a crime. You might find yourself constantly cleaning, checking emails, or organizing drawers, even when you are physically exhausted. And society calls this a strong work ethic. But psychologically, it is often a trauma response to childhood neglect. When a child's emotional needs aren't met, they often conclude that they are only worthy of love when they are doing something or being useful. This is what researchers call performance-based self-esteem. A study published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology highlights how children from neglectful homes grow into adults who view rest as laziness because their internal worth was never validated just for being. You are running away from the stillness because, in the silence, the feeling of being unworthy starts to catch up. And you aren't addicted to being busy. You are terrified of the emptiness that rest forces you to face. But if you think your constant movement is the only way you hide, wait until you see how your physical presence in a room reveals the secrets of your past. Have you ever noticed your tendency to take up as little space as possible? Perhaps you always choose the corner seat in a meeting, speak in a voice just above a whisper, or feel an intense need to clear away your existence the moment you finish a meal. This habit of self-minimization isn't just politeness, it is the physical manifestation of being an ignored child. When your emotions and presence were consistently overlooked by caregivers, you learned a painful lesson, that being invisible is safer than being a burden. This is closely linked to the concept of social invisibility, studied in developmental trauma, where individuals subconsciously shrink their physical and vocal presence to avoid the pain of not being seen. You walk softly because you were never taught that your footsteps had a right to be heard. But have you ever wondered why you feel like an intruder in your own life? You are trying so hard not to bother anyone that you've forgotten. You have a right to exist in the center of the room. This desire to disappear often stems from a much deeper, more complex origin located within the very architecture of your developing brain. Do you find yourself saying sorry for things that aren't your fault, or even for simply taking up space? You apologize when someone bumps into you, or when you ask a necessary question at work. While others might see this as being excessively polite, in the context of childhood neglect, it is often a defensive shield against perceived rejection. This behavior is rooted in what psychologists call toxic shame, a concept extensively studied by John Bradshaw, 1988. When a child's presence is treated as an inconvenience or an interruption, they internalize the belief that their very existence is a bother. By apologizing, you are preemptively trying to minimize the annoyance you believe you're causing. You aren't just being nice, you are asking for permission to be there. Have you ever wondered why you feel the need to apologize for having needs in the first place? But the weight of this invisible guilt doesn't just silence your voice. It often leads to a profound struggle with making even the simplest decisions for yourself. Does a simple question like, "Where do you want to eat?" send you into a spiral of uncertainty? You might find yourself weighing every option, checking others' faces for a preference, or simply saying, "I don't mind, you choose." While this looks like flexibility, it is often a sign that your internal compass was never calibrated. In homes where emotional neglect is prevalent, a child's preferences, likes, and dislikes are rarely asked for or validated. According to research on self-determination theory by Dici and Ryan, autonomy is a fundamental human need. When that autonomy is ignored in childhood, you grow up disconnected from your own desires. You aren't easygoing, You are someone who learned that your opinion didn't matter enough to be voiced. You've spent so long listening to the world that you've forgotten how to hear yourself. And this disconnection from your inner self doesn't just affect your choices, it shapes the very foundation of how your brain processes survival and connection. Do you often find it difficult to answer the simple question, how do you feel? Beyond fine or okay, the landscape of your emotions might feel like a thick fog. This isn't because you lack feelings, but because you may experience a mild form of alexithymia, a subclinical inability to identify and describe emotions. This is a common hallmark of emotional neglect. When your early emotional expressions were met with indifference or were simply not mirrored by caregivers, your brain learned that processing these signals was a waste of energy. A study by Lanius et al., 2010, on the neurobiology of trauma shows that neglect can lead to a dampened activation in the insular cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional awareness. You aren't cold or robotic. You are a survivor whose internal alarm system was silenced long ago to prevent the pain of being ignored. You aren't empty. You've just spent a lifetime being taught that your inner world didn't have a name. This emotional silence is the final piece of the puzzle, leading us to the profound biological and social roots that explain why your past continues to speak through these habits. Why do these habits persist so stubbornly into adulthood, even when we are no longer in that neglectful environment? The answer lies in the very architecture of your developing brain. When a child's emotional signals are repeatedly ignored, the brain undergoes a process called neural pruning. To conserve energy, the brain prunes away the pathways responsible for emotional expression and seeking connection, favoring instead the pathways for hyper-vigilance and self-reliance, research by Dr. Hugh. Edward Tronick, through the famous still face experiment, demonstrates the biological impact of emotional non-responsiveness. When a caregiver's face remains neutral and unresponsive, the infant experiences a massive spike in cortisol, the stress hormone. Over time, chronic exposure to this emotional silence shapes the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, wiring the child to perceive the world as a place where they must be, their own sole provider of safety. Furthermore, the concept of structural dissociation suggests that as a survival tactic, you might have walled off your vulnerable parts to keep the functional, I'm fine part of you going. You aren't broken. Your brain simply performed a brilliant, albeit painful, adaptation to an environment that lacked emotional nutrients. But here is the critical part. Understanding this mechanism is the first step toward rewiring those ancient survival circuits. Your brain didn't fail you. It built a fortress to protect you. The question is, are you ready to learn how to live outside the walls? Understanding the why is liberating, but it's equally important to recognize the thin line between a survival habit and a self-destructive cycle. As we peel back these layers, it is vital to approach these revelations with compassion rather than judgment. It's easy to romanticize these habits as superpowers of empathy or resilience, but we must be careful not to mistake a survival response for a healthy personality trait. Furthermore, this analysis is not a tool for blame. Childhood neglect often happens in cycles, where caregivers themselves lacked the emotional tools they were supposed to give you. Please remember that this content is for educational purposes and self-reflection. It is not a substitute for professional clinical diagnosis or therapy. Human psychology is deeply personal and influenced by culture, temperament, and life circumstances. Not everyone who is independent or quiet was neglected, and your journey is uniquely yours. Healing doesn't mean deleting your past. It means learning that you no longer need the heavy armor you built to survive it. Now that we have explored the shadows, let's look at how you can begin to step into the light of your own emotional truth. We have journeyed through the quiet corridors of your past, uncovering how habits like extreme independence, hyper-vigilance, and chronic guilt are not just personality traits. but the echoes of a childhood where your emotions went unheard. These behaviors were once your survival kit, designed by a young mind to navigate a world that felt indifferent. But as an adult, you now have the power to decide which of these tools still serve you and which ones you can finally set down. Healing begins with the simple, courageous act of noticing, of acknowledging that your needs, your voice, and your presence have always been worthy of being seen. Thank you for spending this time in self-reflection with us. If you recognized yourself in these words, please share your thoughts or a small yes in the comments. It's a way of telling yourself that you are no longer invisible. Don't forget to subscribe and join our community to explore more hidden truths of the human psyche. Remember, you aren't just surviving anymore. You are learning how to truly live. The person you were forced to become to survive is not the only person you are allowed to be.